Hey there, Lionesses. This is Bobby Carlton. I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of Lioness Magazine. I'm also the founder of Innovation Women, an online speaker bureau for women. Today, we are speaking with Banu Ozkazanc-Pan and Susan Clark-Muntean. They are the authors of an important new book, Entrepreneurial Ecosystems, a Gender Perspective. Now you know why I've got them here with me today. I cannot wait to talk to you. So Banu is a professor of practice. You're going to have to explain that one to me. At the School of Engineering and academic director of the I.E. Brown EMBA program. She's also the founder and director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab at the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship. And Susan Clark, PhD, teaches courses in management, organizational behavior and theory, entrepreneurship, and consulting at UNC Asheville. Welcome. I am so thrilled you were able to join me here today. All right. Asheville, Brown, how'd the two of you get connected?
I'll start. So it's a great pleasure to be here, Bobby, and we love you and what you're doing, and we're so honored to be on this podcast and meet everyone in your audience who hopefully will buy our book. So Susan and I met in 2012 in Boston. We were both attending one of the large annual conferences for our division, which is Business and Management Scholars. We had a lot of common interests around entrepreneurship and gender and why we continue to see inequities. And we started having conversations, started collaborating on research. So we've been doing work together for at least 10 years now. So we love working together and we bring sort of complementary views. And it's been wonderful to get this research out there because we've literally been working on it since the day we met, and we had our conversations around why does this keep happening, right?
Exactly. And we've both moved a couple of times during that time period. So we have different ecosystems in Indiana and in North Carolina and in Boston and Rhode Island. And so we're bringing a perspective across the Midwest. We have a scholar that we work with too that spent some time in the Midwest and then the Northeast and then the South. And originally I'm from the West Coast. So I think we bring at least and we both have international experience as well. So we're looking not just at one location, not just Silicon Valley or just Boston, but we're looking across multiple ecosystems. And in doing so, we find patterns. And we also find, similarities and differentiation. And then from that, we can develop theories and identify best practices to inform leaders of entrepreneur support organizations and also to inform entrepreneurs themselves.
Oh, that's great. And now you're saying that this is a 10-year project. Was it originally intended to be a book or did it grow into a book?
It definitely grew into a book. We have multiple articles under our belt and other sort of more practitioner-oriented pieces, but the amount of research that we did simply couldn't fit into journal articles. And there was a lot more we wanted to say and understand for ourselves. So, in the introduction of the book, we say it's been that many years in the making because one, it took us that much time to really understand the complexity of why gender matters to how organizations and entrepreneurs and institutions impact ecosystems and what we need to do to change. But also the field, the discipline in which we publish wasn't always welcoming, and I would challenge anyone who says it is more welcoming now. To gender scholarship and entrepreneurship, it's always been sort of this niche of it's entrepreneurship and gender rather than being central to how we think about. So there's been, I would say, barriers in our own field that we're hoping to also bring down as we think about what this book can accomplish.
Now, I'm going to ask the big question. Can you guys talk about the differences between male and female entrepreneurs?
Yes, I think one of the big myths, and we do a lot of demythologizing in our work, is that there they are so different, right? There's an assumption. And one thing we work on a lot is our assumptions, because as we identify this, what's called a second generation bias or implicit bias or unconscious bias, a lot of that is tied to our beliefs and our attitudes and our perceptions. And so broadly in the population, how we've been socialized and a longstanding, history of religious upbringing and our educational system and the media and so forth, we assume that men and women are in this binary and there's going to be dramatic differences. But what we find is that the differences aren't so vast, and where they exist, for example, when women act with more caution, or maybe are a little bit less aggressive in seeking financing, we find that that's not something inherent in their biology, but it's a rational response to the double standard, the double bar, the much, much higher bar, and the challenges and barriers that they face and resistance they face when seeking funding. So they internalize those experiences and then take on more caution. So it's much more complex. It's much more a give and take between the systems and the institutions themselves and how the individuals respond to them, rather than a individual binary deterministic difference between the genders.
And I'll add to that, Bobby, it also has to do with the way we're socialized into gender norms and, I guess, behaviors and patterns that we emulate when we see others doing them. And so when you are seeking funding, particularly in an industry that's more male dominated, there's a little bit of an incongruence between what your gender is and the kind of occupation that you're in. And when that incongruence happens, there's a little bit of a punishment in terms of seeking and getting less funding than you probably should be getting. So we call that sort of the gender role incongruence, where there's sort of this in people's minds, a mismatch between who you are and what you're trying to do. And the narratives and stories we keep hearing are around successful entrepreneurs who are male and who are predominantly white. And that narrative is actually really strong. It is embedded with values and norms and assumptions on who can be a successful entrepreneur, because we end up pattern matching. And so rather than any innate differences, I think we are socialized. And as Susan pointed out, we're in structures that really cause us to behave in particular ways that are not necessarily what we're born with.
So you both said this. Women get a very small percentage of the funding from venture capital groups. And, at the same time, there are some women who succeed. So I always want to know why, when I look at these really stark differences, less than 3% of venture money goes to women founded companies. Why is it some women succeed and why don't others?
Well, I have I think a response to that, and Banu, feel free to add to this or to add your own opinion on this. But I think that the women that become part of the 3% club, not across the board, but in general, they use the same playbook. That's the Silicon Valley playbook, and oftentimes take on this kind of masculine persona or become one of the guys. For example, Elizabeth Holmes, right? Famously or infamously now, acted, dressed, spoke like Steve Jobs, lowered her voice, surrounded herself by very powerful political and otherwise male leaders, and basically took on the same playbook. And if you look at a lot of the problems that we have, I think institutionally and structurally, systemically in the system, just having women act like men, pitch like men, follow the same playbook isn't going to flip the system or change the system or really even move the needle on the gender gap. And I think that's part of the story, is that they become more like those that are successful because that's their role models and that's how they're coached and mentored and perceived to become successful by acting, exaggerating claims, for example, being super charismatic, and moving fast and breaking things, all of those mantras and how you become successful in Silicon Valley. When those women follow this playbook, they might break that glass ceiling, but it does really nothing, I think, to challenge the system or to change the system.
No, I completely agree, Susan. And the only thing I would add to that is maybe it's not a question of why, but a question of how. And Susan just, articulated that it's the how. There is sort of this implicit behavior norms and expectations of how to become successful. They're just coded male and coded mostly white. And some women figure out how to do that. And at the end, they may individually succeed, but as women founders, it doesn't change the dynamics. And I want to point out that 3% is generous. Last year in 2021, it was 2% of all VC funding. And around 87% of all VC funding went to all male teams.
Oof.
Happy Friday.
Yes. Happy Friday. I sat in on a briefing that you did when you launched the book. And one of the things that absolutely got my attention was you said, and maybe I didn't quite understand this, but I just want to check in on this. You said women who get funding through special programs for women entrepreneurs are twice as likely to not get funded in the future. Can you talk to that? Did I understand that correctly?
I think the dynamic that we're picking up on is that there's a signaling that goes on. It's similar to the concerns some people have with affirmative action, is that when someone's a recipient of some special programming based on their race or their gender, everyone else assumes that the only reason or the predominant reason they received the funding, the grant, the entry to college, whatever that is only solely because of their status in that category, being a person of color or a woman. And so what's happening with that dynamic of them, it actually harming women in later stages of funding if they get, say, angel investment from a female-founded, female-focused, women-only programming, is that later rounds of what's so-called mainstream or traditional male-dominant venture capital firms and so forth, the assumption is the only reason they got equity funding is because of their status as a female and not because of merit or because of potential or because of innovation or so forth. So that's the dynamic that I understand is what's going on with that result of actually getting female-only funding or programming is harming women at later stages of the game.
Yeah, and I want to share the research that we use for this. It's a study by Kaisa Snellman out of INSEAD in France and Isabelle Solal, who's at ESSEC. And what they find is they did a field study of venture-backed startups that firms with female founders who received funding from female rather than male VCs are 2 times less likely to raise additional funding. And they find no equivalent investor gender effect for male-founded teams. So we know, and then in addition, that pitches by female-backed female entrepreneurs receive lower evaluations compared to all other pitches. And that is driven by the perceptions of the entrepreneur's competence. So there's a gender competence connection there, where as your gender is coded female, your competence goes down in terms of how you're evaluated. So while there's a lot of well-intentioned calls for women to invest in women, that actually puts not only an undue burden on the female investors, but it might actually undermine sort of the long-term success of women or female entrepreneurs, because it's signaling, correctly or not, that they need to go for this alternate funding rather than the pool of capital that's available in the ecosystem at large, that they cannot get funding unless there's a special pot of money for them. And this is a similar dynamic for new majority founders or minority founders, that there's the signaling that happens that you have to go for funding that is meant for you. And when you do that, they're signaling later on that potentially you only got it because you were of this background. Very similar to diversity initiatives in corporations, where the understanding is you got this job because you are X, rather than out of merit or you're just really an amazing person.
So what does this mean for the programs that are out there that are specifically designed for funding women entrepreneurs? I mean, should we stop that? My goodness, it feels like we just got to our 2.2% or whatever, and we keep pushing, but what can we do?
I think there's a place and a space for women-only networks, women-only platforms, women-only funds, and so forth. So I think absolutely we need those, and they fill a specific purpose of support, psychological support, network support, emotional support, access to resources that women can support women, and I think those ought to absolutely remain thriving sources of resources. But I think what needs to happen, and what Banu and I focus on in the book, is we need to change the system. We need to change the so-called traditional, mainstream, very male-dominated institutions and the mindsets and the ways in which decision makers make investment decisions of who to fund, because that is where the problem lies. The problem does not predominantly lie in individual women or women as a category. They don't need to be fixed, which is what so much of the programming is focused on. Let's fix the women to be more like men. And we're calling that out as being not the major source of the problem. And so I think not ending those programs, but really being mindful of their potential landmines with accessing those funds. But going beyond that, let's fix the systems themselves to be more inclusive, to be more gender aware, and to fund women more from male-dominated funds. So it's really, we've got to fix more in changing the men and changing the leaders and just continually refocusing that. Because there is a lot of well-intentioned programming, a lot of women that want to make change happen. It's just understanding that it's not about fixing ourselves or getting our own women-only support network and funding. We've got to fix the funding that isn't coming to us.
Okay.
I think what we see in these programs as intentions are really good, and we completely understand, and we don't think we should be doing away with them. They are individual fixes to a systemic problem. And until we understand that systems view, which is what we're trying to articulate in our book, that we're still going to be pushing people into a system that doesn't work for them because it was not built by them. And so we need to rebuild it, right? As women, as anyone who's been left out of it, we need to start thinking about issues of, who makes the rules and who makes decisions, who has influence in ecosystems. And traditionally that has not been women. And I think that's what we're trying to change is all well and good. Do your individual programs that benefit women, founders, that's important. But realize that when they are out there in the ecosystem, that still has a lot of work to change the existing structures.
So are there things that you learned that women entrepreneurs themselves can use? You did mention earlier that, some of the successful women in terms of getting funding were adopting more male-oriented patterns of behavior. But are there other things that we can do to be more successful that maybe haven't been getting enough attention in some of these studies?
I'll start with this one, Bobby. Yesterday, I was fortunate enough to speak to a cohort, the third cohort of Zane Venture Fund, which is out of Atlanta, and it's run by Shyla Nieves-Bernice, who's a woman of color, and she's a solopreneur right now as an emerging fund manager and a VC. And one of the things that I focused on is this idea of imposter syndrome, right? And that is something that a lot of women and historically marginalized people will often think about, and that will limit, what they do, who they ask money for, or who they believe can support them. And I think we need to really rethink this idea that it's a syndrome, it's a phenomenon, it's not a diagnosis. And 82% of people have felt it in the US at some point in their career. And there's a lot of things you can do to sort of move away from that internal negative dialogue that limits your ability to take ownership and feel positive about your successes and your achievements. Because when you meet people who over and over and over again tell you no, it does start to wear you down and you can internalize it. So one of the things you can do is to really understand and name that thing you're feeling, which is an imposter phenomenon, and to take measures to start addressing it. And the American Psychological Association has actually wonderful insights into things you can do that range from sort of owning your successes, sharing your failures with, trusted others, and really monitoring that internal dialogue around how you think about yourself and how you think about your achievements.
Yes, and I would just add to that, I've done some kind of popular press articles and public speaking and podcasts and so forth, with specifically addressing this question of what can individual women, business owners do to combat resistance and biases and barriers in the system. And one of the really important, in addition to what Banu was saying about imposter syndrome, is recognizing that you are not alone, recognizing that it's not your fault, and recognizing that you're not the problem. And that sounds very simple, but if you think about what we're saying and internalize what we're saying, that the problems are systemic, institutionalized, that is not an individual level issue. There's maybe some strategies that individuals can do when encountering that bias. But I think at the get-go, recognizing it's not your fault. And it's not something, again, there's a lot of gaslighting that happens too, right? That what are you talking about, gender bias? Like, you're making stuff up, or, and that in itself is damaging because it calls us to question the actual barriers and resistance and second guessing and condescension that's happening. But if you look across so much of our research and our qualitative research and our interviews across different stages of the life cycle, different geographies, different ages, different types of entrepreneurs in different sectors of the economy, so many had felt that kind of condescension or second guessing and so that's not about those individual women or even the individual sector or stage of their business that they're in. It's about something in society, some kind of attitudes or beliefs or social norms, and that's what needs to be fixed. So I think even just hearing that is comforting and creates some confidence of going in that there's nothing wrong with you. You're doing the right thing. Just keep powering through.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos. Stood trial, sentencing, also subject of a new Hulu series, The Dropout, based on the ABC News podcast. Meanwhile, Adam Neumann, who's the male founder of WeWork, another high-flying and, let's say, messy startup, walked away a wealthy man. So is it just gender that causes these problems?
I'm going to start. It's Judith Butler, who's a well-known feminist, writes about gender trouble. I guess this is a type of gender trouble in that, just to extend Susan's conversation here, what we say is it's gender blind sexism. And it's everywhere. It's pervasive. It's the idea that I don't see gender, I invest in the best ideas, but meanwhile, they're coded, right? So when you look at something like Theranos versus WeWork, and you see similar dynamics, similar behavior patterns of outlandish claims, charisma, little bit of telling untruths, or maybe a lot. And then you see, if you were to read these in parallel, the ways in which Theranos is focused on the individual actions of Elizabeth Holmes as being someone who is untruthful. There's even sort of conversation on her outfits during the trial, and her behavior, her mental health, her relationship with her co-founder. Whereas if you look at the analysis for Adam Neumann, it's like, this was a high-flying person, SoftBank believed in him. So it's sort of, despite the fact that it's a systems failure, it's not coded as an individual who failed. It's like, it just didn't work out, so the explanations for it are much more external to his behaviors, whereas for, I would say, Elizabeth Holmes, they're individualized on her. And that's coded by gender, right? So for us, it is just gender, but just gender is a whole complex set of social, cultural, and institutionalized norms in the society that we live in that is sometimes hard to see past it. And so we like to call it this idea of gender blind sexism, which we borrow from colleagues who talk about violence against women, where it becomes normalized, right? And we hope to change that.
Right. And we talk about these case studies in the book. And one thing that also, I think, again, looking at these side by side, gender becomes relevant for Elizabeth Holmes, but it's silenced. It's gender blind for Adam Neumann. So we don't really talk about his super kind of hyper masculine, charismatic, the way, he had keggers and all this kind of stuff. We don't talk about his like masculinized behavior and him being a man as a reason he got that funding from SoftBank. But we talk a whole lot in the public press, whether that's New York Times or a lot of the articles or the documentaries that are coming out. We talk a lot about her clothing choices, her hairstyle, and her being a female, and her femaleness stands out. And so gender becomes a very, very prominent variable in understanding what happened as an explanation, when what we're saying is that it's systemic and there's problems with the system. And that's why you had failures on both of these cases. But instead of treating these as systemic failures, it's put on the gender of the person.
Wow.
The female, not the male so much.
Gotcha. All right. Great conversation. So much to think about here. Anything you want to share in closing?
I hope you will consider buying the book. It's available on Amazon.com. And really the audiences for that are change makers, leaders, people that care about this gap, that want to fix it, and really understanding entrepreneurial ecosystems, how to build them and change them to be more inclusive and to serve a much wider array of entrepreneurs. And so if that's a passion of yours or interest of yours, definitely buy the book.
Excellent. I want to add that if you're also a founder, I think the book will be helpful because you'll hear stories like yours of women of color who have had to traverse some of the similar challenges, and to know that you're not alone and that this is going on a wider scale, which may be of some comfort, but also to know that it's a systems issue and we're all individually navigating it. So, we want to make sure that everyone understands that as we all work towards change.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us on Lioness Magazine.